Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Monday night live stream. Coming to you on an increasingly cold South Manchester evening. And good evening to you all out there. We will begin with the customary greetings in the live chat. So, good morning to Ash on the other side, another end of the world there. Good evening to Jerry, and hello to Slava out there in Chicago. Hello to DE. Excuse me. Good evening to Alex out there in cold and rainy Wales. Well, why change the habit of a millennia? Good morning to Banana Bender, who says quite correctly, Free Palestine. And good evening to Peter, who's only able to pop in tonight. I'll catch it up tomorrow, comrade. And Banana Bender says from the river to the sea, quite correctly. Good evening to Burke. Good evening to Satyajit Malik, and who says, greetings to all fellow anti-imperialists, and greetings right back to you. And hello to Irish Partisan, our comrade out there in Minsk, who's reporting a cold and rainy evening. And President Jesus out there in California, or the tyranny of Gavin Newsom, as it's otherwise known. Right, we are here tonight to discuss, Palestine and Ukraine, and why. I think the question was posed by Peter, I believe, on a live stream a couple of nights ago. Why is it the case that so many people from the typical left are getting the question of Palestine more correct? I don't want to say entirely correct, because there's a lot of mistaken interpretations out there, but much more correct than they were ever getting the question of Donbass and the question of the Ukraine war. And it's an interesting topic, and I think that by ploughing through this and interrogating the question, we can discover certain things about why it is that the left in the imperialist countries has been so wretched over the question of the Ukraine war. So, before we get to that, though, I want to just give an update on where things stand at the moment, because there are some developments coming out of particularly, I believe, Syria. So there's been apparently 3 separate US bases have been under heavy attack this evening in Syria, and that is in the area of Syria that the US still occupies, in the words of Donald Trump, to steal the oil. And this has caused Biden to interrupt a speech. They've had to wheel him into the Situation Room. Joint Chiefs of Staff are meeting, along with Sullivan and Austin, all the people who are out of their depth together. The US is already blaming an Iranian-backed group. Who knows? Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. We don't know at this stage. But what we've been talking about here for the past couple of weeks on the channel, i.e. the possibility that the various groups that oppose the presence, or should we say, the imperialist interventions of the United States, including their imposition of themselves as occupying forces in various parts of the Middle East, including, of course, most prominently northern Syria, in connection to the escalating situation in Gaza and the attacks upon the Palestinian resistance by the U.S. colonial forces known as Israel, this is going to merit a response, draw a response against other U.S. bases in the region from the various armed forces that are resisting U.S. attempts at continued occupation of Syria. And also we've seen attacks, quite small scale so far as we know, individual rocket attacks on US bases in Iraq. There was also the rocket attack launched from Yemen the other day, which was looking more and more likely, to me anyway, that this was something that was directed at the US ships in the area, not even at Israel itself. So now there's been a major enough attack to motivate the hierarchy, the shall we say, tottering political hierarchy of the US empire to have an urgent meeting. And they must have known this was coming or something was coming, because there's no shortage of individuals and groups out there who want to evict the US from northern Syria. And it was an obvious target as well. It was one of their larger presences still in the region, along with what they've got left in Iraq, outside of course, the official bases that they've got in Saudi and that they've got in Jordan as well. I believe they've got some kind of presence there. So an attack on their bases in Syria, we'll see what this turns into. It's clearly serious enough to merit a sort of panicked response from the hierarchy in Washington. So we will see how this plays out. They will blame Iran, whether Iran is responsible or not. And there will be now a increasing pressure inside the halls of Congress for the weak and enfeebled Biden administration to quote-unquote do something about Iran. Of course, what they can actually do about Iran is rather limited. They can't launch a ground invasion of Iran. That would be suicidal. They don't have the manpower to do it. They could, of course, try to launch a bombing campaign against Iran, but then the Iranians have the capacity to destroy or severely disrupt the global oil trade by blocking the waterways around Iran and around Saudi Arabia as well. So given the fragile state of the global economy, that might not be a flyer either. So if I had to guess, and I am purely guessing about this is not something that I have extensive information on, I would say that the attacks that are coming against the US bases are escalating as a warning sign to the United States of what they can expect if the Israelis go ahead with their ground invasion, which of course there is an awful lot of pressure upon Netanyahu to do from his coalition partners and the maniac Kahanists. They all want to do it, but I noticed that most of them seem to be more concerned with carrying out pogroms in the West Bank, where of course they tried to rush into a refugee camp the other day and apparently got repelled. There was also an Israeli incursion into Gaza, a scouting trip apparently by the Israeli armed forces the other day, over the weekend, and that resulted in at least one death, several wounded, and they beat a hasty retreat out of there. And that was in the northern part of Gaza, where they've been essentially doing borderline saturation bombing. So this is a escalating situation, shall we say, and we'll know more about what's going on in Syria tomorrow, so I will come back to it then. Tomorrow, by the way, we're going to be on earlier in the day, probably 2 till 4, depending upon how much we've got to get through. So moving to the topic at hand and pausing if only to say hello to various people who've just joined us. So hello to my comrade Beiju from Barnet. I'm sure Barnet's not that boring, Beiju. I'm sure there's something to do down there. Michael Hodgson, good afternoon to you from Canada. Slava says, Palestine question has been there for 75 years. Ukraine situation is quite fresh and new. That's true. Get more on that in a minute. So, ground invasion incoming. Well, we'll see. I still verge on the doubtful side, given other factors, and also the factor that every time the Israelis have tried to attack into Gaza over the last decade, well, really the last decade and a half now, they've ended up losing an unacceptable level of casualties to the resistance forces there. But probably more on that tomorrow than today. Will Johnson, good evening to you out there in Holmfirth, West Yorkshire. Holmfirth, by the way, was one of the places in which one of the most famous English old school comedies was shot. This thing called Last of the Summer Wine, which ran for about 30 years. So, famous place that we have a viewer in. Philbin says, hello comrades, Free Palestine rally at Providence, Rhode Island State House on October 21st, and the pouring rain drew 1,000 cynical New Englanders. Great to see. Yes, and the whole explosion, shall we say, the proliferation of Palestine solidarity rallies in the United States itself, I think is worthy of some discussion, given that this is the place that the imperial center where the Israel colonial project is run out of, where there is a formidable lobby operation, as documented by many people, including the likes of Blumenthal and Cohen, a formidable lobbying operation to keep the politicians on side, and a lot of money moved around there. A lot of money made out of the Israeli colonial project in the United States. But as we were covering the other night, also a population that's increasingly, at the very least, split on the issue. At the very least, it's closer to 50-50, if not in some groups outright opposed to further weapons shipments to Israel at the very least. So there is at least a very significant body of opinion, even amongst those who are registered as Republican voters, against further supplies to Israel. Now, of course, when the pro-colonial position dominates the political structure in the United States, this might not make itself felt immediately. But the proliferation and demonstrations, the fact that this is more and more seen, I think, even in the United States, as a well, I don't know how Americans would describe it, and most Americans would describe it, but I would use the term as a ruling class project, or if you wanted to use another term, an elite project. In Britain too, the fact that the demonstrations in London have got bigger, and there's going to be more of them, and another demonstration across the major cities in Britain next Saturday. I'll be at the one in Manchester again, and there'll be another one in London, which you'll think they're aiming for it to be bigger than the 300 to 350,000 that was there on Saturday of last week. So, and as Lachlan indicates in the comments, it's really winding up the reactionaries, not just the political reactionaries and the so-called bourgeois intelligentsia like Dougie Murray, but also the government in this country is getting increasingly rattled by them. You've got this idiot of a Home Office Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, babbling on about the Met not being tough enough on the demonstrations, that they should have arrested more people. Of course, yeah, they were prepared to arrest more people. The Metropolitan Police, of course, the notorious police force of London, backed up by the City of London police force, who are a police force who are wholly and solely responsible to the financial institutions of the City of London. They had their riot squads mobilized. They were ready to carry out arrests, but it would seem that the demonstration in London was too big for them to handle. And if they tried arresting loads of people, they'd have probably ended up in a riot, and they'd have probably lost. So remember, of course, as I've said before, just how quickly the policing dissolved in Britain in 2011 when there was those nationwide riots across certainly England. I don't think they went into Wales and Scotland as much, but in 2011, riots in London, Birmingham, and Manchester. I think Leeds a little bit as well. Yorkshire people, correct me if I'm wrong. These were just like riots of like lower end, poverty-stricken working class and lumpens. Chased the Metropolitan Police off the streets in London inside a few hours, and they lost control of the situation almost entirely for nearly a day, and that caused serious panic. So the police chiefs in Britain aren't quite as stupid as the politicians, and they realised that if they waded into this thing trying to arrest loads of people, leathering people, which is what some in the government want them to do, that they'd ended up with a disaster. And so I think that the permanent bureaucracy in the Home Office and the police chiefs are a little bit smarter than that. They know very well that if they let these things pass off peacefully, it's less dangerous for them than starting a fight, essentially, a fight that they might not necessarily win. So apparently there was 10K in LA, which is, maybe our Californian comrade can confirm, 10K for a demo that's specifically anti-imperialist in Los Angeles. Is that unprecedented? If you could reply there. Yeah, and the New York City one, what was that? Was that 100,000? 6 figures? That would have, I mean, having a major anti-Israel demonstration in New York City is also going to really yank the chain of the reactionaries in the US government and the ruling class. So, having been myself quite cynical about demonstrations after the experience of the anti-war movement, these ones are clearly worth doing. They're clearly growing. They're clearly tapping into something, and it's clearly discombobulating elements in the ruling class who didn't expect this. So these are definitely things to build on, and then that's before we even get into the question of the German ruling class's attempt to reimpose the laws of Otto von Bismarck and ban these things altogether, which again will backfire on them. The problem for all of these authorities now is that their hold is actually very weak. And this is true in all the imperialist countries now. And I was having this discussion with some comrades earlier. Now, what is clear is that, and I was actually out in, you may have seen the pictures on Telegram, I was out in Sefton Park with the Communist Party comrades yesterday. We were doing, selling literature, handing out leaflets, etc. And, you get we got I would say, a pretty damn good response, given that it was the first time we'd done it. And one of the things you discover from talking to people is that it's very rare these days that you will run into somebody who comes up to you and enthusiastically defends the system. And even 10 years ago, you did still get largely sort of middle-class people, golf club types, who would come up and have a go about how wonderful capitalism is. And Britain is so rich. What are you doing out here? Socialism's failed. What are you doing? You did get a few of them in central Manchester a decade ago when I was doing stuff then. You don't really get many anymore. You get the occasional student who fancies himself as being something of an anarcho-capitalist, a Manchester Milai, if you will. But you don't get many coming up and enthusiastically defending the system. You maybe get a few fascists who will come up and start babbling about, Islam destroying Britain or something. But there's very few who will come up and defend things as they are. You get the occasional Eastern European as well, usually somebody who's born long after the socialist systems ended, saying about how they were born under communism and it's terrible. But usually those are just people who are repeating whatever the hell it was that their parents told them. Interesting evolution. My point here being that the systems, the systems in the imperialist countries are a lot more vulnerable than they appear, which is why the British ruling class so far have been a little bit cleverer than the Germans and have decided not to make too much of an issue of this, despite the politicians ranting and raving. The politicians only have as much power in this country as the permanent bureaucracy will allow them to have. Right, we've got people feeding back here. Hello to Munis. Banana Bender, huge numbers. I was shocked. One Israeli showed up to provoke. It was bigger than the Zionists, however, and this was in Sydney. Good job. Salon, no. If you're not familiar with what happened, the monetization I applied for monetization and ultimately got turned down because YouTube said that in too many of the videos we've got on here that I was either making light of or downplaying the war in Ukraine. Now, if you're familiar with the coverage that we've done of the war in Ukraine, I don't think I've made light of anything, and I don't think I've downplayed anything. In fact, we're about to spend at least 45 minutes talking about how important the Ukraine war is, even now, to the imperialists. So what it means is doing anything critical on the Ukraine war and doing anything critical from the perspective of consistent anti-imperialism. So they removed the monetization and they removed the super chat options, basically. If you want to support the work that we're doing here, then go onto Patreon and subscribe on there if you want to, because that's the way to do it. It's a slightly more secure way to do it. Trying to get monetization out of YouTube, doing the kind of content that I'm doing on here, is pretty much a non-starter, as it turns out. So, Paul Charo says, as Alex astutely pointed out, Douglas Murray is a pound shop conservative. In my opinion, his only value is taking a pulse on current mainstream reactionary conservative mantras. Yeah, he's a complete buffoon. He's basically, they tried to make him into an intellectual a while ago, but to be an intellectual, you at least have to have the semblance of an idea. He's just basically a walking, talking, particularly obnoxious Daily Telegraph editorial. And I speak as somebody who reads the Telegraph fairly regularly. All right. Satyajit Malik says, pro-Zionist sentiment is very strong in Germany within the left. I've heard this off numerous German comrades over the years, that it is. I mean, I'm a bit surprised about that in some respects, given that there was, if I'm remembering this rightly, the whole network that produced like things like the Red Army faction in West Germany was very strongly anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist. I know that whole political tendency was stamped out and shot and murdered by the West German state. But the fact that there's still a strong pro-Zionist element within the German left is, well, I shouldn't be surprised, but I'm, needless to say, rather disappointed. I am going to be trying sorting out an interview with a German comrade pretty soon about that. Newsflash, this is from Irish Partisan. Al Omar, US base in Syria, attacked by swarms of unmanned aerial vehicles. Very interesting. Drone warfare, as expanded upon during the Ukraine war so far by both Russia and the NATO forces, is now everywhere. Philbin says, Alex mentioned impressive role of DFLP, PFLP in Gaza counterattack. Overall, what is the state of the Palestine left compared to the heyday, arguably in the 70s? Well, I would say that the PFLP and DFLP have played an integral role, a very important role in Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. Certainly they're active fighting on the ground. So they've maintained their forces, I think at the very least. They were never the majority in the PLO. I think that the PFLP was significant, but they were never the bulk. I mean, the bulk was always Fatah, who were essentially like a combination of sort of social democrats, Arab nationalists, or Nasserist types, and they made up the bulk of it. And the Oslo process discredited them, even though PFLP and DFLP were on board with the Oslo process for a little while, but they pulled out of it before the grim end, when Clinton tried to get Arafat to sign a final sellout deal, which I will go into in more detail in a future stream. And the PFLP and DFLP pulled out, and they were both important in forging the unified resistance movement that we now see in Gaza. And this was a big part of this was the unification of the prisoners inside the Israeli jails in the 2000s. That there was a degree of unity found between Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Fatah at the time, and the PFLP and DFLP all forged this unity together. I think a lot of it did come out of the prisons. So it's a movement that was somewhat driven by the militant end, by the fighters themselves, less so by the Hamas and PIJ political hierarchy, but they've been forced into this necessary unity now. So yeah, in terms of the wider left, I mean, Fatah's sellout, PLA's sellout, and the role of Abbas has damaged like the what I would call the soft left, the sort of Arafat left. But the PFLP and DFLP maintaining themselves and playing such an active role in this shows that they've still got significant support within the Palestinian population. And because of their participation in this latest operation, that support will only grow, and Fatah's support, such as it is, will only drain away further. Right. What else we got here? German guilt is weaponized, says Satyajit Malik. Yes, I can see how that would be a tactic. Greetings to CJ out there in Richmond, Virginia. And Irish Partisan says Al Tanf and Al Shaddadi bases attacked with multiple bombings reported. President Jesus says George Floyd protests in LA were 50K by comparison, largest ever, and in US history was 1.5 million in 2006 over an anti-immigration bill. I remember that. Was that the that was the Bush era, wasn't it? Yeah. Red Star Betty says, good evening to comrades from all the way from Durham. Glad I'm able to catch the stream tonight. Well, good to have you here, comrade. Martin says, good day, comrades. Tuning in from a laundromat somewhere in the USA. Very poetic. CJ says, the networking in prison reminds me of Iran in the years of Savak. Very good point. Paul Charo says, in Sydney, police were seeking to arrest Palestinian protesters in hindsight last week. Not sure about the following protests. Yeah, given the extensive powers that all the police in the imperialist countries have, it wouldn't be a surprise if they tried to potentially target ringleaders. I mean, Australia seems worse to me in terms of rabid authoritarianism and the cops running out of control, or at least the cops being empowered to do whatever the hell they like. It seems worse than Britain. There's a lot of repressive laws here, but the cops do use them, but they are usually quite selective in the way they try to apply them, of course. I mean, Australia, both during COVID and now, seems actually worse. It seems as authoritarian as the United States, possibly even worse. It definitely seems worse than here. Maybe Australians want to comment on that. But moving to the topic in hand, which is the Ukraine and Palestine. Now, of course, there's the why is it that so many who are now getting it right, or much more right, more correct, over the issue of Palestine, were unable to analyze the situation in Ukraine properly. Now, of course, there is the point that Slava's already mentioned, which bears re-emphasizing, that the Palestine situation is 75 years old. It's a case of a long-term displaced population who were obviously and blatantly fucked over by first British imperialism and then US imperialism. So there is, of course, a long-term direct responsibility and obvious responsibility of US imperialism and British imperialism there. It's long been, Palestine that is, a established cause on the British left, going back, I'd say at least until since the 1950s. I mean, there was the old Communist Party in Britain did used to campaign against the Nakba and the Zionist crimes against the Palestinians back in the 40s and 50s. I think a lot of this on the broader left took off much more during the period after Suez in 1956, when the Israelis played the role of essentially acting as the muscle to a degree for the French and the British imperialists against the Egyptians. I think there was a lot of pro-Zionist sentiment on the British soft left, including some of the big stars of it, like Nye Bevan, was a Zionist. Because remember, the early Israeli leaders like Ben Gurion and others dressed themselves up as social democrats and pretended and said that this was some sort of great utopian socialist experiment. Of course, they were drawing on the second international tradition of social imperialism and social chauvinism there. And as Unused Sub comments in the discussion forum there, Eric Heffer, who was the long-time left-wing Labour MP for, was it Liverpool Walton that Heffer was MP for? That he was an ardent Zionist as well. Apparently, there was a lot of this in the left wing, the old left wing of the Labour Party. A lot of them bought into the Zionist project, and partly because it was the way it was marketed was it was a social democratic project, and all of them bought into it. A lot of these Labour left wingers are actually social chauvinists, social imperialists. Their attitude on imperialism was always dodgy. But after 56, I think particularly into the 60s, and certainly after the Six-Day War, pro-Palestine positions became a lot more popular on the broader left in Britain, even making it into a sort of a regular fixture inside the Labour Party in terms of motions to conference. Still to this day, you still get pro-Palestinian motions to conference, which the leadership always ignores, by the way. But it also became a very accepted part of the trade union movement. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign and its predecessors became an accepted part of the trade union bureaucracy. And so it has that history of being embedded within the British left. I'd also say that on the Palestinian question, there's even a slight divide within the British ruling class itself. They, of course, in the majority, still back their Israeli project, their Zionist colony, which, of course, the British imperialists were instrumental in setting up. There was, after 47, though, a distinct minority, but a minority nonetheless that bears mentioning, in the British ruling class who regarded the relationship with Israel as a bit of a problem. They weren't really in a position to do anything about it, and certainly they weren't proposing an abandonment of it. But some of them, the ones who are more perhaps tied to or interested in building up relations more with the Arab states, they see the alliance with Israel as something of a hindrance to doing that. So there is a minority within the bourgeois who are uneasy about the way that the politicians have all gone all in on support for Israel. Some of them, perhaps the wiser of them, are seeing that the support for Israel is getting more and more of a shaky prospect. And so this is part of the reason why you do get more critical reporting on Israel than you get on the machinations of the imperialists in Ukraine. So you do get that in Britain. I know that there have been anti-Israel stances taken within the US bourgeois political sphere, but I think that is mostly confined to like Pat Buchanan on the right, and I'm not even familiar with. Cynthia McKinney was another one who took an anti-Israel stance, but I think that she got it the wrong way around. The Zionists don't control the US government. The US government controls Israel. Right. I've got some more comments coming in now. Ash says, in Australia, especially Melbourne, police are carrying old military gear. So, yeah, you've got the same police militarisation in Australia as you get in the United States and here as well, to a certain extent. So the cops in Manchester at the weekend were largely just dressed in their regular uniforms. Makes me think that some sort of arrangement had been made. Paul says, I think ringleaders, yes, I think you're right. They are more rabid and authoritarian, though. Sydney is not such a violent city overall. Lachlan says, and it's gotten more authoritarian down here, presume you mean Australia, with the new communications bill which allows for sweeping censorship by the government. Hello to Paul Charo, who's saying hello. We're introduced already. James Graham says, Zed, right back at you. Unused sub says, Tony Benn had a Zionist phase. Interesting. I probably did read that in his diaries at some point, but it's a long time since I read them. It wouldn't surprise me, though, because even he said that he was a fairly typical politician, Labour politician, until the early 70s. Putin's shirt says, it's time the Zionists to admit failure. They haven't created a safe and secure homeland for the Jews, which was their expressed earthly goal. Well, I think they traded that in a long time ago for becoming the servants of first British and now US imperialism. I think that the current miserable gang in charge of Israel would abandon most of the more working class elements in Israel. I think this lot would abandon them in a heartbeat and be on the plane back to New York with most of the other dual passport holders when the shit hits the fan in a serious way. Irish Partisan says, it's interesting to note that an increasing number on the right have taken a very strong pro-Palestine position. Yes, interesting. I have seen slightly more of the sort of the internet-based right-wingers take a more anti-Israel position, But most of the so-called dissident right in the United States, they went all in with Israel, like that pair of morons that run Compact magazine basically just turned into Dick Cheney. All their dissidents disappeared when it came to the sight of the quote-unquote natives rebelling. It put the fear of God into both of them, apparently. So what you get with these dodgy Catholic types. They all turn into John Paul II at a moment's notice. Alex Jones has given an increasing platform to pro-Palestine voices, the greatest broadcaster in America to this day. Good evening to Roddy. Yeah, GMP turning up at somebody's door. Yeah, I think that's that video, I think, was brought about by somebody clearly ratted on that guy to the police. I don't think that was the case of the cops just turning up. It was somebody had rung up and made a complaint about it. You've got to wonder who. Which is, of course, the danger with these laws, which is that the cops might not go out of their way to use them, but there's plenty of scumbags out there in every country who'll rat out their neighbours, rat out people they work with for expressing pro-Palestinian sentiments. I mean, you want to talk about a police state, Britain has got all the necessary architecture to enact one. And of course, we've got things in this country like the so-called Prevent program, which I think I've mentioned before on the streams, which essentially introduced a state informant system into the healthcare and schooling system, whereby anybody who expresses an opinion which is regarded by the authority figure, either doctor, nurse, teacher, or social worker, as being extremist, and bear in mind what's defined as extremist in most of the imperialist countries is anybody with an opinion that you can't find in, so we say, the Times, or then perhaps the New York Times if you're in the United States. And anybody with those opinions is reported through this system essentially to the police. And I've had people say to me in the past that, yes, you end up with like teachers who are particularly reactionary, like grassing on children, who or saying that this child is expressing extremist views. I thought this was what the dreadful communist regimes were supposed to do. Turns out it's all the capitalist ones doing it. Right, moving on. President Jesus says Mehdi Hassan has finally been allowed back on the air. Now he's comparing Israel to Russia to sell the cause to liberals. Yes, well, this is the new line, because Biden, of course, tried to say that's Putin and Hamas working together. So the opposite line, which I saw, I think it was Richard Eskow took it as well in one of his videos. So Mehdi Hassan's now saying Israel is just like Russia. Well, that's going to go down well. But this, of course, should bring us to the question. So I've already said that Palestine is an issue, long established history in the British left, even if it's got some differing degrees of what solidarity means. But it's an established cause with a slight difference of opinion even within the British ruling class about just how much they should back Israel. So with all of that, you get a bit of differing opinions still within even main bourgeois news sources. The Ukraine thing, a little bit different, as Slava indicates. It's partly because it's new, but also because I think that the project which it leads to is one that is, I would argue now, even more important to the ruling class than the Israel colonial project. Now, bear with me on this one because it might seem a little counterintuitive. But if you look at the way in which the ruling class whipped everybody into line over Project Ukraine, over the Ukraine war, from February of 2022 onwards, and got almost everybody, barring like the consistent Marxist-Leninists who are, I think most of us are in this chat, or people that there's one party, as far as I know, possibly two in Britain, that held the line that the struggle in Donbass was an anti-imperialist struggle and that Russia is not imperialist. The CPG-BML held that line and continued to do so. And I think the other one, the CPBML, might have done as well. I would need to check their website on it. But I think they rejected NATO and they rejected the war, I think. So that will be definitely one, possibly two, out of the entire left. The rest of them took an incredibly confused and strange position. And that's because the level of propaganda from the British ruling class was at a degree which I would say is been unmatched in recent years. Anybody who could recall, like back to the days of the Iraq War, the War on Terror, yeah, there was a lot of propaganda then, and there was an awful lot of lies told. But even back then, there was more dissent even within the bourgeois press because there was a split in the ruling class back over Iraq and even over the whole War on Terror issue. The ruling class was completely unified, almost completely unified in Britain over the Ukraine war. And that's because the project to which it is attached and which it has been attached to for many years is one that they've been working on obviously for quite some time, which is to turn Ukraine into a battering ram against Russia with the idea of provoking a war, which they got, and enabling them to pile on the sanctions against Russia with the idea, as we've covered many times, that the Russian economy would collapse, the Putin government and the Putin system would collapse, and it would enable them to either install a stooge regime, probably not Navalny, but some other exiled oligarch, some Yeltsin type figure, possibly a bit more sober, or and of course break down the barriers to looting the country entirely, or see the country break up. All stemming from, of course, the plan originally outlined by Paul Wolfowitz all the way back in 1992. So it's an important investment for the British ruling class. American ruling class, take it as read that this applies to them as well. But for Britain, it's very important. What's going on in Ukraine is incredibly important because they are in a deep hole. British imperialism is in crisis. It has been for many years, since at least 2008. You can argue, as I have frequently done, that the crisis actually originates a lot further back. But certainly they need to take out a potential barrier to their exploitation, not just in terms of the ability to loot the resources of Russia, but a country that was becoming an increasing problem for them in getting their own way elsewhere. Bear in mind the intensification of their efforts to build up Ukraine only came after, of course, their being thwarted in Georgia, and then just after, of course, their overthrow of the Yanukovych government in Ukraine, the intervention in Syria began from the Russian Federation in 2015. They'd been kind of increasing their involvement earlier, but their full-on intervention started in 2015. So the project in Ukraine takes on ever more importance because, of course, what it is directed at is taking out the Putin government entirely. That's the aim. And that's why, of course, the entire ruling class needing this boost to profitability that could only come through destroying one of their major opponents, either Russia or China, and they decided that Russia was the easier one. They thought that in February of 2022 that this was the time. They had their opportunity. As we've said many times, clearly they hadn't done the homework, and clearly they hadn't seriously looked into the precautions that the Russians had taken, or they'd told themselves that it didn't matter. So the importance of that project to British imperialism was paramount. I'd argue it's still even more important than Israel to the British ruling class. To the American ruling class, maybe a little bit of a different story. There is going to be a much more bitter row over who gets prioritized for monetary aid and weaponry over between Israel and Ukraine. But for the British ruling class, the project in Ukraine was and remains of absolutely paramount importance. Destroying the government headed by Putin breaking up or severely weakening the Russian Federation not only enables the unrestricted looting of the territories of the Russian Federation, but removes a potentially dangerous barrier to their ability to loot and destroy other places. Think of the difference, of course, between what happened in Libya, where they were able to successfully destroy it and loot it, and in Syria, where they came close but were turned back, partly by the resistance provided by, of course, the Syrian government, but also with the assistance of Iran, Hezbollah, and, of course, Russia. And for all those reasons, the removal of the current government of the Russian Federation was an absolute priority. In February of 2022, they thought they had their chance to do it. So they went full bore with the propaganda. And of course, if you can portray it as, the evil Putin, and Putin's been demonized in official British propaganda for roughly, I would say, since at least about 05, 06. I think it's to that point. Prior to that, they were willing to shake hands with Putin and smile at him as they tried to stab him in the back. They never stopped their attempts to undermine the Russian Federation, as Putin himself has pointed out many times about their engagement in the Caucasus. So, the British ruling class have been looking to get rid of Putin for a whole number of years. Their propaganda has been relentless in terms of the demonization of the current Russian government. The entire left in Britain, other than a few exceptions, have routinely mischaracterized the nature of the current Russian government, the nature of its economy, the nature of its state. They've dismissed it as imperialist, despite the fact that any serious investigation will show you that the predominant exports of the Russian Federation are commodities, often in the form of oil and gas, and not capital. The capital exports of the Russian Federation for years have mainly related to the export of capital by oligarchs out of the country. And so the entire British left has failed to analyse the modern Russia properly. They either dismiss it as just a continuation of the Yeltsin era, where I think you can demonstrate very comprehensively that it is not like that. They have failed to analyse properly the nature of its economy and its state. They've failed to seriously do any analysis on what was powering the Maidan in Ukraine, and before that the Orange Revolution. They've failed to analyse properly what colour revolutions consist of. So when you put all that together, the fact that the British left is crap on imperialism anyway. It consists predominantly of revisionists and Trotskyites whose analysis of imperialism has always been awful and wildly inaccurate. You have the fact that the ruling class are completely unified around the project in Ukraine, and that they need this destruction of the Russian government badly to revive their own fortunes. And you combine those two things together with the fact that the labour aristocracy and the trade union bureaucracy, of course, always fall into line when the British ruling class goes full bore for a war. And it really is a matter of the fact that the prize in front of the British ruling class was a big one, and therefore they were completely unified in their pursuit of it. And therefore all the institutions on the left and in the trade union movement that would have any repository of oppositionism within them were overwhelmed and fell into line very, very quickly behind the ruling class, because the British ruling class hasn't shown this level of absolute unity for quite some time. I mean, they were fairly unified over Brexit, but they lost. There was a significant minority who were pro-Brexit. The majority weren't, though. Over many other things, I mean, you could say back in the Kosovo war period, the British ruling class were pretty damn united on that. But I've not seen the level of absolute lockstep unity within the ruling class, all of their propaganda sheets, all of their news channels completely on board, completely lined up for it. And again, that tells you the importance of the Ukraine war and the importance they place upon destroying the Russian government and being able to put in a stooge regime. It's obviously a massively important project to them. Taking out one of your principal opponents whilst not losing, well, being able to say you didn't lose a man doing it, as Lindsey Graham said, best money we've ever spent. And so, to go back to the Israel thing, I'd argue that the preservation of Israel is obviously important to the US imperialists. The mission in Ukraine, the war on the Russian Federation, the attempt to destroy the Russian government, that for the British ruling class, I think, is even more important to them than the question of Israel. Now, if Israel continues to lose and gets more and more destabilized, we may see the priorities shift. But at this stage, I'd say that the British ruling class are much more unified about Ukraine and the need to try and use it against Russia, even more so than they are Israel right now. Okay, so ironically, most of Israel's support from in the USA comes from hard right Christians, not Jews. Well, yeah, that's from Unused Sub, that comment. It's very true. You get a bit of that here as well in Britain, like the ultra like reactionary right wingers. They are obsessed with Israel. Some of them are, at least. They think that this is because they see it quite correctly as a settler colonial system for them to defend. And they might not like Jews very much, but they like settler colonies, and they don't have South Africa to cheer on anymore, so they cheer on Israel. Irish comrades can confirm this. I think some of the loyalist paramilitary murals in Belfast have Israel flags on them because of course there's a long history of solidarity between Irish republicanism and the Palestinian cause, and so the loyalists took the opposite stance and decided to become Zionists, which is kind of appropriate considering that Zionism has much more in common with messianic millenarian Protestantism than it does with actual Judaism. Salon says, seems like pro-Palestinianism is one of the few points of agreement between institutional left, anti-revisionist types, CPG-BML, and the general working class. Rare left full house. Well, I'd say the institutional left are shaky on the question, but they're generally better than they are on most other things. So credit where credit is due. It's also, for us, it's an opportunity to actually go out there with the proper line on why it is that the British government has been involved in the crimes of the Zionist regime for, 100 years, and contextualize Israel properly in its place in the existing imperial system. So yeah, it is a rare piece of unity these days. Heavy airstrikes right now in Avdiivka in Ukraine. Of course, the Russian Federation's campaign to take Avdiivka continues. Quite an extensive series of analyses done on that. I'll be talking more about that tomorrow. But we've got to catch up with the Ukraine war issues. Philbin says, natural comparisons to resurgent pro-Palestine demos and sentiment with anti-apartheid, pro-ANC movement of the 60s through to the early 90s. Any lessons we should keep in mind? Mistakes to avoid as Marxist-Leninists? Well, I mean, the biggest thing I would say to bear in mind is that, of course, whereas the demos and the solidarity movements did matter back then, we should always keep in mind one of the big reasons the apartheid regime had to surrender in the end, or had to at least call for negotiations, was because the South African masses made the country ungovernable for them, to the point where they would either have had to fight an open civil war, which they would have probably lost, or cut a deal. Unfortunately, of course, this was at the time when the treacherous Gorbachev clique had managed to finally destroy the Soviet Union, and the world anti-imperialist movement received an enormous setback. And so you get the deal between the ANC and the National Party that essentially kept the economic structure of the country intact and ceded political rights to the black South African population. So a step forward, but with a series of inadequacies, which hopefully the economic freedom fighters can complete that unfinished revolution pretty soon. in terms of our mistakes in the West, I think what we've got to do is we've always got to, first of all, be absolutely clear about the true depth of the abominable crimes that the Zionists are committing, but that we've got to show how that is part of an imperialist system with the US at the center of it and Britain central to this as well, though not as much as it once was. Its power has diminished, but that Zionism and the Zionist state of Israel are able to do what they do because it's a mission for US imperialism that they are there and what they are carrying out, what they have been carrying out. And therefore it's important to keep emphasizing that. This is a US colonial project. That's the reason why they're so invested in it from the US side of it now. It's the reason why they will not give it up unless they are under unbelievable pressure. And it's the reason why, of course, Israel gets away with so much. Every single one of its crimes are the crimes of US imperialism. US imperialists stand behind it most of the time, hiding. But the other thing to bear in mind is that now they're increasingly coming out into the open and taking control. Like this coalition government in Israel has clearly been put together on the orders of the United States. There is an American, at least one American Free Star general who is advising the Israeli army at the moment as to how to conduct themselves. So it's clear, the American army hasn't fought actual full-on wars, but they have fought some kind of urban warfare and insurgency operations in Iraq. So they have more experienced general officers on this level than the Israelis do, who are just basically a large police force that goes around brutalizing the Palestinian civilians most of the time. So the imperialists have now been forced to come out from behind the curtain and take more direct control over the Israeli colony. And so these are the things that we need to be pointing out to people. Where are we now? Mike Pence, vomit. Yeah, very true. Says Putin's shirt. A lot of human trafficking going from Ukraine to Israel. Yeah, a lot of human trafficking, sex trafficking from Moldova, I'm told, and Transnistria, the breakaway region of Moldova, through to Kosovo and the Balkans, and also down to Israel. Like, as I've emphasized before, Kosovo, Israel, Ukraine, centers of organ trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, people trafficking, and centers of the porn trade as well. It's like, this is what happens when your country gets turned into essentially an outpost of imperialism, which is what Kosovo is. Kosovo is essentially a US puppet regime. Israel is a US colonial project, and the Ukrainian banderists are running a US puppet regime as well. When that happens, you get all the filth and squalor of decaying imperialism comes to your country as well. That, and of course, in Ukraine, there's substantial evidence presented by the Russians that they're running biological experiments on human beings over there. There are allegations that the Israelis have been running biological experiments upon Palestinian prisoners as well. I don't have any firm details about that. These are speculations and stories coming from Palestinian social media, basically. But given that that has been confirmed that they've done this to prisoners in Ukraine, they used to do this to prisoners and people in mental institutions in the United States. They outsourced it under Obama. This was one of Mr. Fauci's innovations. And now it's in Ukraine. We know that it's in other places as well. It would not surprise me if this is what Israel was doing to Palestinian prisoners. They got thousands of people that they've abducted off the street. You're going to tell me that they've treated them well? No. These will be exactly the sort of people, these sort of prisoners, who the US would be more than happy to see horrific experiments conducted upon. That the full truth of that will only come out when the regime falls for good, as it may do very soon. Unused sub says Mongolia are currently trying to cultivate Siberian separatism. Not a surprise. Mongolia is, if very much under the control of imperialism. I think the Russians will be fully aware of it, though. I mean, they are moving to develop the Far East now. But Anna Bender says there is apparently a book being released next year on the whole Novichok poisoning scandal. Interesting. Is it going to be a book portraying the thing as it was, or selling more fictions? Beiju asks, why do you think Israel and the West seem to not care about losing the propaganda war with their continual bombing of children, hospitals, and civilians? I don't think it's that they don't care, Beiju. They put a lot of effort into propaganda and various other sort of bullshit stories that they tell to keep at least a semblance of opinion on side. I think the reason why that why they're losing the propaganda war is because, of course, social media gives a new aspect to this. I mean, 15 years ago, you couldn't have gotten the stories that you've got from Palestine that we see every day on like Telegram and on Twitter now. You couldn't have got those 20 years ago, not in the same way. And so part of the reason why they're losing the information war is that there's increased communication from the war zone directly to us who know how to seek these things out. Partly it's because the bourgeois press has become more and more despised and distrusted, even by people who very much aren't communists. They don't like the press. They don't trust them anymore. The politicians are widely despised. The level of authority that these things carry within even the imperialist countries has diminished significantly. So that's partly the reason why. The other reason is, of course, they're behaving in the same way that they always did. They haven't in any way, you could say that they've got worse, but if you read Norman Finkelstein's work, this is the way they've always behaved. I think the difference is that we're seeing more of the damage that their crimes do directly now, whereas before it would be cut up into a 5-minute package and sanitized and put on the BBC. And then Jeremy Bowen would come on. He's one of the BBC's Middle East guys. He'd come on and go, oh, well, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. Israel denies everything. Who's to say what the truth is? Moving on. Now you can see it yourself through independent media. So to us who have a degree of political awareness about this, we can see through it all now. And to the broader population who might still be aware of the bourgeois press, the bourgeois institutions have lost so much credibility that even though the Israeli propaganda dominates them, they're still not able to carry the day anymore. So it's a question of the damage has been done on multiple levels to their narrative there. So it's not sticking as much as it did. Ash says, looks like the doctrine of the grand chessboard is still a dominant one. I actually thought Israel was more important, but there is more public support for Palestine than the ruling class like. Yeah, there is. It's much more. Israel is a difficult sell now. They can still get away with selling Ukraine. They can still use the narratives they've taken from the idiot left about Ukraine being an oppressed nation. It is an oppressed nation, but it's a nation being oppressed by the imperialists. So I would say that the reason why Biden put more money into the Ukraine package than the Israel package, or he wanted to, whether Congress will let him pass it is another question, is because that project's more important. It's even more important to many in the ruling class, even in the United States, than the preservation of Israel. And a lot of them think that Israel's not going to fall now anyway. But the prize there is huge. The profits involved, the ability to revive imperialism's economies. It's an enormous prize. Right. Where are we now? Irish Partisan says the West supported a colour revolution in Belarus as a way to install a pro-West client regime in Minsk in a bid to surround and weaken Russia before the move by Kiev to seize Donbass. Entirely correct. Marco says you are absolutely right regarding KS, Ukraine, Israel, Kosovo, Ukraine, Israel connection. Even Ukrainian army was in Kosovo. Interesting. Salon says US imperialists support Israel as a captive weapons market and Middle East army base. How does US benefit from Palestinian displacement also, or is extended conflict just good for weapons sales? Tell you what, Salon, as I'm running out of time at the moment, I've got to crack on with something else. I'm going to take your comment and pick it up tomorrow. Gannibal says Israel human trafficking, sex trafficking goes all the way back to PGIKP. What does that stand for? If you could clarify. Philippines, apparently. Interesting. The book is anti-establishment. Okay, so the book on Novichok is anti-establishment. Ben says, evening comrades, hope comrades can make it down to London. This weekend will be huge. Think larger effort in largest demo better than spread sparsely. What do others think? Interesting question. make the London demo massive or go for demos around the country? Tell you what, as I'm running out of time, I'm going to pick that one up tomorrow night, comrade, if that's okay. And good evening to Mike Martinez, who's just joined us. Right, I got to crack on, comrades, but I will be back tomorrow, 2 till 4, so please join me for that. Until then, though, I will